Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam Wong, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology and proprietor of the Princeton Election Consortium.
Well, this week Donald Trump tried to calm down some of the tensions that emerged within the GOP when he finally endorsed Speaker of the House Paul Ryan in his primary challenge, and he came out finally in favor of Senator John McCain, as well as the senator from New Hampshire. And Hillary Clinton, for many months, has been running a campaign in conjunction with the Democrats, promising to make a play for the Senate and possibly, with Donald Trump as the candidate, maybe even see if the Democrats can retake the House with her coattails. And part of Trump's move this week was an effort to calm some of the nerves that have emerged within the party, not only about him and about the White House, but about what effect his candidacy will have on the House and Senate. So the campaign has triggered the discussion about coattails and whether we're going to see that in this election and how that might work. This is an old term that has been used since the 19th century when we talked about straight party voting, which was more common. Now we're in an era when, at least in the last few decades, where people had been more willing to split the ticket. The actual way in which we vote has changed so that people aren't voting up or down for a party as they are for particular offices. And there are some examples people are talking about where in presidential campaigns the coattail effect can be quite dramatic. Here on this podcast, Sam, we've talked about the 1964 election where Lyndon Johnson had a landslide victory against Barry Goldwater and brought in massive liberal Democratic majorities that lasted for a few years and which allowed him to enact the Great Society. And we've seen other examples of this. And we've also seen the other kind of example, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, where presidents didn't experience that effect all the time and had to govern with some sort of divided government. So I thought today might be a good time to talk about coattails, how they have worked, how they might work in this era of a polarized electorate. And I think this might be one of the big stories that we need to be following, besides whether the Republicans will somehow jettison Donald Trump. So let's talk about it. Sam, what do you think, and what do you see as significant coattail effects that we might be looking at in this election?
Well, I think that was a great description of coattails over the years. I'm not a real scholar of coattails, say, in the last century. I'd be really interested in hearing more about that. But let me just talk about post-war coattails just a little bit. The phenomenon of downticket turning out the same as the presidential race is something that I would say has been pretty strong in the last 15 years or so, since 1992. Since World War II, up until about 1992, the phenomenon has been that sometimes the Republicans win the White House, sometimes the Democrats win the White House, but it has always been the case in every presidential election from 1948 to 1992 that the Democrats won the popular vote. That is, if you add up the number of votes cast for Democratic congressional candidates and you add up the number of votes cast for Republican congressional candidates for that, 44-year period from Truman to Bill Clinton's first election, Democrats won the popular vote every single presidential election, as opposed to sometimes Republicans winning, sometimes Democrats winning the White House. So I don't know, if there is a coattail effect, it just wasn't that strong in the period following World War II. And then I would characterize the big shift in terms of coattails happened at the same time as other big shifts. We've mentioned on this podcast before the idea of polarization, where the parties choose up sides, voters choose up sides, and are relatively immobile. And if I look at the data, between 1992 and 2012, so the last, 6 presidential elections, the presidential popular vote and the congressional popular vote have typically been within about 4 points of one another, the exception being 1996 when there was a three-way race for the presidency, and then there was an 8-point discrepancy. But over the last 6 elections, the presidential race and the congressional vote been within about, the margins have been within about 4 points of one another. So let's say that that polarization held up, which is a big question mark because this is a crazy year. But if it held up, then a big win by Hillary Clinton would be, in fact, pretty ominous for down-ticket Senate and House races. And you touched on several of those Senate races. The interesting thing that I noticed there is that as Donald Trump tries to be a conventional Republican and talk about a tax plan that sounds like the House tax plan, and he starts endorsing Senate candidates in Arizona and New Hampshire, he's actually unifying the ticket, and I'm not convinced that people down ticket want that.
It's funny. There was a story, I believe it was on CNN, trying to explain how a lot of the Senate Republican candidates are really struggling with what to do about exactly what you're talking about and what the best posture is. So you have some who are distancing themselves from Trump as much as possible, not mentioning him, not formally endorsing him, maybe giving subtle hints they'll vote for the Republican at the top of the ticket. But then there's other evidence, I believe, that if Trump loses, they will lose, that they are connected to him whether they like it or not, and they need a Trump victory or you're going to have a pretty awesome showing for the Democrats. So, it's hard to gauge where these Republican candidates and what they should be doing right now, given that potential threat.
Well, I guess looking at the data, the way I would put it is the way I would look at the point you just made is that the Republicans are mostly unified, and the key word here is mostly. So, let's say about 80% of them seem to be okay with Trump as their nominee. Maybe 70–80% of them can tolerate that and will vote for him. But then there's this wing that just don't want Trump at all. A prominent example of that is Ted Cruz. But if you look at Ted Cruz's favorability ratings after the convention speech he made, in which he very pointedly did not endorse Donald Trump, his favorability numbers dropped by about 10 points. And so it's pretty obvious the trap that that down-ticket candidates get put in, namely that they don't want to be tied to an unpopular candidate, but they also don't want to alienate voters of their own party by saying bad things about their candidate. And so they're stuck in this bind in which they've got a party that's just divided enough to put them in a corner. And as I mentioned in the previous podcast, we're talking about maybe 10% of voters, 10% of all voters who are Trump diehards. And if that 10% of voters gets angry, that's not so helpful for down-ticket Republicans.
Yeah, it could be the Tea Party effect that members of Congress or members of the House have been dealing with, which brings up another issue in terms of coattails that you've written a lot about and worked on, which is a structural story. And so there's been this question, how do you have any kind of massive presidential coattail effects with partisan gerrymandering? And there's a line of argument that gerrymandering has become so sophisticated in the last few election cycles because of computer technology and the ability to pinpoint voters that swings in the House just won't happen. And you hear that today. You hear people say, well, the Democrats might take control of the Senate, but the House is impossible because of the way these districts are drawn. They're solidly red, and even with Donald Trump, they're going to remain solidly red. And I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on this, since this is something you've really worked on.
Yeah, I have done a lot of analysis on this. I worked on this back in 2012 when I got surprised about the Democrats winning the popular vote, but the Republicans holding the chamber. I will say at the beginning that, just to build a little bit of credibility, that the last person I encountered in the news talking about the possibility of a Democratic takeover of the House is Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan, and he uttered that possibility. So I will say that when members of the majority start talking like that, then possibly it's on people's minds. So I think it's better to not make statements like this categorically. And let me just go back to 2012 and just say that if you take the 2012 national congressional race and take all those races where, as I said, Democrats won the national popular vote, if you gave more votes to the Democrats in each district in the U.S. and asked how many would you have to give them in order for them to win the majority that year in 2012, they would have had to win the national popular vote by about 7.5 percentage points. Now, it turns out that if you look at the generic congressional preference poll this year, it's currently at Democrats plus 8%, and that's a median of multiple polls. It took a dip during the Republican convention, came back up with a vengeance after the Democratic convention, and so now it's at a level that is, in fact, at or above what would have been necessary to win Congress, win the House back in 2012. So that number, if it were to hold up, I'm not saying it will or it won't, but at its current level, it's at a level that is on par with retaking the House. Now, if we get back to your point about gerrymandering, I'd say the way to think about that is there's a couple of major factors that make it hard for seats to swing very much, mainly having to do broadly with the fact that most districts in the U.S. today are pretty lopsided, strongly Democratic or strongly Republican. The fact that many Democrats are packed into cities probably gives about a 10-seat advantage to the Republicans because a lot of those Democratic votes are not well used. And then partisan gerrymandering in states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and other states, Ohio, for instance, that partisan gerrymandering is probably worth about another 10 seats. And so, roughly speaking, Democrats have to overcome, close to, it's not quite that many, but it's close to a 20-seat deficit because of structural and political factors. And so it's not impossible, but it is a wall that needs to be climbed. And what it means is that it's not enough to just win more people voting for their side. They actually have to win by a largish amount, which is, getting back to the theme today, is made somewhat more likely by a very weak candidate on the Republican side.
It's really an incredible story, that dynamic, because when you study the history of the presidency, what's clearly extremely important is very basic. It's the composition of the Congress a president has. And so you can see this with President Obama. His 2 years of great legislating came in the first 2 years when he had united government, and since 2010 it hasn't been all downhill, but it certainly has not been a huge list of legislative accomplishments, and he's relied more on executive power. And we teach that if you don't understand this dynamic and you don't understand the kind of Congress a president can have after an election, you really don't understand just how limited presidential power is. I've written a lot about this with Lyndon Johnson. And so if you have this 20-seat advantage that the Republicans are enjoying, which is a big hill to climb, barring someone like Donald Trump just totally changing this part of the election, it's setting up a very difficult situation for a Democratic victor. So if Hillary Clinton is president and his candidacy is not enough to shift that balance, she's going to face a very difficult House of Representatives, and there'll be no honeymoon period or anything. So, yeah. I mean, it's a big story of what's happened in American politics.
I'm under the impression that the last two Congresses have been unusually unproductive legislatively, and I think that as overlap between the parties and ability to find ability or willingness to look for common legislative interests has disappeared. I agree. I think looking just at the number of bills that have cleared Congress, the number of laws that have been signed into law, it's been an unusually desolate period in U.S. politics. It makes me, at some level, it feels like the U.S. system might be better off with some kind of parliamentary system where there's not a check between the executive, where in the UK the closest thing they have to an executive is the Prime Minister, and the Parliament. Because at this point, if we have a deadlock where judicial nominees get held up, legislation gets held up, modifications to legislation like fixes to Obamacare, all these things just get paralyzed, and it feels like it would be an awfully good idea for the logjam to be broken in some way. Ironically, I don't know, maybe Donald Trump could help with that by dividing the Republicans and getting Congress and the White House on the same side.
He could. I mean, the only good news is that exactly the criticism and proposal you made has been talked about repeatedly in American history. So Woodrow Wilson spoke about that in the 19th century when he was writing. When I wrote this book on Lyndon Johnson, what was incredible is in the early 60s, before the 64 election, if you read all the books and articles on Congress, all of it is about a dysfunctional Congress. Where nothing's getting done, where there's a total logjam on the big issues like civil rights. And then you have something like the 64 election with coattail effects changes all that. It's just for a few years, but it was able to end what one Democrat in 63 called the sapless branch of government, and he was referring to his colleagues. That's why this coattail issue is really important, and whether Trump has some effect in our current system, that really is the only solution, as Obama learned in 2009 and 10. The other thing that's come up this week, it feels like an unfolding reality show sometimes, is we now have another third-party candidate has just come in, Evan McMullin from the CIA. No one really knows who he is, but here he is. And one of the issues that this brings up is how will the now three third-party candidates impact the election and impact this issue of coattails? Will they have an effect by running in some of these battleground states in affecting the outcome here?
Yeah, Mullen is probably a novelty candidate in the sense that it's not even clear how many states he can get onto the ballot. And something like half the states have had ballot deadlines pass, and so any newcomer is going to face a pretty serious problem. One place where this McMullin fellow can make a difference is I believe that he is a Mormon, and
yes.
And that means that in places with a large Mormon population, most notably Utah, but also Arizona, Nevada, he is somebody who could make a difference there, because there are a lot of Mormons who don't seem to care for Donald Trump very much. Weirdly, this year, Utah is within 10 points. And for Utah to be within 10 points for the Democratic candidate is just, by recent standards, a fairly freakish occurrence. And so it's pretty clear, as we've mentioned before in this podcast, that that there are a lot of Republicans, enough Republicans who have not come home to their candidate, that that places like Utah are in question. So somebody like him could, in fact, if he gets on the ballot, I don't know too much about his access at this point, could make a difference simply by giving voters a place to go. Now, I will say that paradoxically, that might end up being not so bad for Democrats down ticket, because then at least Republican voters could have someone to vote for when they go to the polls. And so rather than stay home, which would be one possibility, they would then go and cast a protest vote for that guy. And in the end, he might actually end up being having sort of a rescue effect for say, Congresswoman Mia Love, who is a Utah Congresswoman who's kind of didn't get elected by very many votes last time.
That's interesting. So the third-party candidates might have this effect in this state, but others like Ohio, where Portman's running a tough campaign right now, where it gives Republicans a reason to vote for their party, but they can still vote for someone else for president if they don't like Trump. So it won't. That Trump doesn't necessarily depress voter turnout in the GOP as much as he might in some of these states, and that can help the Republicans.
Yeah, it could be, you know.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that would be an effect, not necessarily of the new third-party candidate, but even the Libertarian ticket in places like Ohio? Is there any evidence this will matter?
I don't know. The Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, is polling higher than Libertarians ever have. You know, that's a party that's never gotten more than 1% of the popular vote in the U.S. ever. And so for them to be for Johnson to be polling in the whatever it is 5 to 10% range,
yeah,
it's for them a huge win. So it's not the kind of win that gets them elected to office in very many places, but it is at the level of past performance for Libertarians. It's a relative breakthrough, and so yeah, I think, you know, hard to say, but it could be enough of a call it a patch on the bleeding that's going on the Republican side.
Are there any states that you see in your study of the polling where the coattail effects for Hillary Clinton might be strongest? I mean, we're talking a lot about Trump and who he turns away from the ballot, Goldwater-like, but I guess the reverse is there anywhere where you can see that Hillary Clinton, there's excitement about that ticket, or that the ticket, regardless of Trump being the nominee, might be able to turn votes blue rather than red in the Senate or House?
It's hard to separate the idea of coattails from just a state where one party is stronger than you might have expected from past elections. And those two things are very hard to disambiguate just by looking at data. But I would say that there are states where Democrats are stronger than expected over the last few elections, and they are North Carolina, where it looks like polls indicate that Clinton's ahead of Trump at the moment. Arizona, where it looks like things are closer than one might expect, and those are places where there are Senate candidates who are engaged in pretty close races. There are women in particular in those states: Ann Kirkpatrick in Arizona, Deborah Ross in North Carolina. These are candidates who might have a fighting chance. Coattails, I'm not sure, but certainly those are states where Democrats are stronger than expected, and I think that there might be a story there as fresh polls come in the next month or so.
And obviously, if there are coattail effects, the size of them matters, because likely the midterm elections will be very different. And all the presidents who've enjoyed great landslides learn that 2 years later things go pretty poorly. All midterms are bad, but when you have a big landslide in it sets up a moment of legislating. 1938 for FDR was really difficult midterm, and 1966 for Lyndon Johnson. So there's both, are there coattail effects, and how significant is the size? Because you could have razor sharp majority after this where the Democrats retake the Senate, but it's not enough to really push things, especially if Republicans have the House. And 2 years later, without Trump being at the top of the ticket, you could have a strong wave election that puts the Republicans right back in power more viciously than ever if you're a Democrat.
Well, Democrats, let's see. So Democrats have a lot of vulnerable seats coming up in 2018. Something like, by some measures, something like 10 more vulnerable seats than Republicans in the Senate. And so 2018 is looking to be a pretty hard year for Democrats. At least that would be the baseline expectation. So that's one thing. Generally speaking, one consequence of polarization that collides with the way our system of government is set up is that Senate terms are 6 years long and presidential terms are 4 years long. And if it is generally true that midterm elections are hard for the president in party, then if you stop and think about that, well, let's see. If you have a president who gets reelected, then the first time that president gets elected, then a bunch of members of his or her party get in. And then 6 years later, if he or she is still in office, then 6 years later, those people come up for reelection, and they are coming up at a midterm for their own party, and so they're left high and dry. And so this 6 year versus 4 year thing added to modern polarization leads to these terrible whipsaw effects where things go back and forth. And so there's a uniquely bad combination of circumstances right now driven by partisan polarization.
It'll be great for historians like myself to study legislative strategy in the White House years from now, how it was all working. These are difficult factors to think through when a new president comes in and basically tries to schedule and map out what they're going to do. It's just if you have any window, it's so short at this point. And you can expect a backlash that's so severe. It must be maddening when you're trying to calculate what to do, what the sequence of proposals should be, what to expect 2-3 years in terms of funding. I want to end with what we did last week. I thought it was a nice new feature for our podcast. I wanted to ask you if there was a particular poll that you found this week or that you saw that you think is interesting and relevant and something that we should be looking at in this election.
Well, we've talked about the generic congressional, which is currently at at Democrats plus 8%, so that doesn't count. I will say that the thing I really want right now is there are polls that do not exist that I would love to have, and so I'm going to turn it on its head and say that it would be super duper to have information on 5 women who are all in close Senate races. They're all women, and they're Ann Kirkpatrick in Arizona, Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada, Deborah Ross in North Carolina, Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, she's ahead currently, and Katie McGinty in Pennsylvania. So there's a little bit of information about several of these candidates. Specifically, Hassan and McGinty seem to be ahead at the moment. McGinty close to a tie. But I am dying to have information on these 5 races. As I said, they're all women. We're in this lull in the season where typically people are not that interested, but it's a weird year, so people are more interested than usual. The down-ticket effects right now are most apparent at the congressional level, in the generic ballot, but it would be super interesting to know what's happening in the Senate. So I feel like I'm going to take a pass on your question and say that I am waiting for the shoe to drop on down-ticket Senate races.
That's a good wish, a good wish list to leave the pollsters with, and maybe someone will listen to this and respond, and we can have more information to go on next week. So that wraps up our episode. I hope everyone can join us next week when we'll continue with our discussion. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Bye, everybody.